in English. Donc, il s'agit d'une réunion qui est ouverte au public, donc une réunion d'experts qui réfléchissent en ce moment à la constitution d'un groupe international d'experts sur les migrations, un GIEM, G-I-E-M, un peu sur le modèle, mais enfin, mutatis mutandis, sur le modèle du GIEC, du groupe d'experts sur les climats, sachant que les questions ne sont pas les mêmes et que les procédures ne peuvent pas être les mêmes. En particulier, le GIEM que nous envisageons n'a pas de support étatique prévu à la différence du GIEC. Ce matin, donc cette initiative est partie de 3 chercheuses de Sciences Po et du CNRS. Virginie Guiraudon. Virginie, peux-tu... Voilà, Virginie qui porte la chaise et mais qui n'est pas que porte-chaise dans la vie, qui est une grande chercheuse spécialiste notamment des politiques migratoires européennes et qui est directrice de recherche au CNRS. Elle travaille à Sciences Po. Il y a également Hélène Thiollet. Je ne sais pas si Hélène est là. Elle nous rejoindra sans doute plus tard, qui elle est à Sciences Po, aux relations internationales. Et puis donc Camille Schmoll. Est-ce que Camille est là? Non plus. Donc Camille qui est géographe et spécialiste à Paris Diderot, non à Paris, c'est à Paris Diderot, et qui est notamment une excellente géographe de terrain qui a travaillé sur les migrations méditerranéennes en Italie, à Malte, à Chypre, etc. Donc ce sont ces 3 personnes qui ont pris l'initiative d'un GIEC des migrations. Elles ont écrit une tribune qui a été publiée, c'était au mois de juin ou de juillet, donc ça fait un certain temps déjà. Cette tribune a eu un écho international extrêmement important qui a pris tout le monde par surprise, que ce soit en Allemagne, en Angleterre, en Italie, aux Pays-Bas, donc, et en particulier auprès des principaux des chercheurs qui dirigent les principaux centres de recherche sur l'immigration en Europe. La seconde étape a consisté à réunir aujourd'hui, ce matin, ces directeurs de centres de recherche européens, plus quelques chercheurs notables. Il y a également un Américain qui est là. Enfin, nous sommes aussi divers que possible. Et nous avons réfléchi donc aux différentes façons de procéder, aux objectifs d'abord, aux difficultés d'un tel défi, et puis ensuite un éventuel mode de fonctionnement. Et il y aura tout à l'heure, à 18h, 18h30, une conférence de presse qui va un peu lancer officiellement ce groupe d'experts internationaux sur le climat. Nous commencerons par des choses modestes, c'est ça l'idée, et puis peu à peu, en fonction des réalisations, nous essaierons de prendre de plus d'importance. Voilà un peu ce que je peux vous dire pour l'instant, mais comme je ne suis pas à l'initiative de ça, mais j'ai tout à fait accepté, à la demande des 3 chercheuses que j'ai citées, j'ai accepté que l'Institut Convergences Migrations, ou l'Institut des Migrations, comme on voudra l'appeler, dont je suis le directeur et qui vient d'être fondé, qui est en cours de constitution, puisse héberger cette initiative côté français. Mais je dois dire aussi qu'à Sciences Po, le LIEP, le laboratoire international d'études et d'évaluation des politiques publiques, a joué un rôle tout à fait important dans le cofinancement de cette opération, dans la logistique de cette opération. Et je tiens vivement à remercier ici le LIEP, le laboratoire mixte de Sciences Po, qui, avec le Collège de France et l'Institut des Migrations, donc, a l'honneur de vous accueillir ici. Voilà pour l'introduction. Et donc, je laisse maintenant à... c'est Virginie, c'est toi qui vas prendre la parole, ou c'est Hélène Thiollet qui vient d'arriver, qui va... voilà. Alors, Hélène est jeune mère de famille, son enfant est là, il a participé ce matin à tous nos débats. On peut entrer très jeune au Collège de France. Et si de temps en temps, vous entendez un gazouillis très discret, ne soyez pas surpris, ça n'est pas nous, c'est la jeune génération montante, pour laquelle nous travaillons, bien sûr.
Merci. Oui, oui, tu vois, c'est comme tu veux. Merci. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. This is our first public session of this afternoon, and this one will be in English. We have the great honor to have had a very renowned international colleagues come today to discuss an all question, speaking truth to power and the relationship between science and policy. I'm going to briefly introduce them, but I want to explain why we're having this session. François Héran, our host here at the Collège de France and ici Migrations, recall that we did launch a call at the end of June last year. And today we meet on the day where actually the Global Pact on Migration is being signed in Marrakesh, in Morocco, that states that there should be more research on migration. Our view was not that of course there should always be more research, but that was not exactly the main issue. Is that we were angry nerds, to use Hélène Thiolet's expression. What is the good of research when you see the kind of decisions that were taken, for instance, in Europe in 2015 and before, of course, 2015, and the kind of reactions you had, and you heard a lot in the media, but also policy leaders stating counter evidence, things that for a long time researchers from various disciplines in various countries have studied, and that we thought were either false or just misperceptions, and a misunderstanding, for instance, about basic questions. Why do people migrate? What are the basic drivers of migration in relation, for instance, to migration and development and this kind of issues? So what we thought we would start out our discussion is by asking these very distinguished scholars. I asked them for about 7-10 minutes. I say 7-10 minutes, so you know why you have 10 minutes. To each present their view on that gap, that science policy gap, and an issue that they think is from their own discipline or from their own national, because we are still living in nation states, their own national perspective is somewhat of a wrong way of going at understanding how you make migration policy making, or a wrong way of understanding migration and how we can move forward as a scientific community on this issue. So first, Steven Vertovec, of course, you all know, is a director of the Max-Planck Institute in Göttingen for the study of religious and ethnic diversity. If I said diversity, you're going to say super diversity. I say no more. Then Christina Boswell was a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Edinburgh, who has actually worked on the politics of knowledge in relation to migration, both looking at the case of the EU and different national cases. We'll speak Ferruccio Pastore, who comes to us from Salvini's Italy. Now he's the director of FIERI, of the Turin, the pioneering Institute on Migration in Torino. We'll actually look at exactly take some recent cases. That's why I mentioned Salvini's Italy. Recent cases of decisions regarding migration policy making in Italy, and his reactions as a researcher. And Leo Lucassen, who is both professor of history at Leiden University and at the International Institute. I'm going to say it wrong. Sorry. Of Science. Sorry, Leo. The full title: International Institute of
Social History.
Social History. I was going to say H for Humanities. Social History. International Institute of Social History will also give a presentation on the issue. After this 4 presentations of, as I said, 7 to 10 minutes, we'll have we can open it up for comments and questions before a final roundup by our speakers. So, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Virginie. Is this on? Hello. Good afternoon. I appreciate the invitation to come give my 7 to 10 minutes. And it's actually a historical moment for me, not just to be at the heart of a new initiative, but I think it's the first time in more than 10 years I've spoken in public without a PowerPoint. And the people at my institute aren't going to believe that I was able to do that, but I'll do my best here with just some quickly scattered notes. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, not to talk about policy science. I'm not a policy guy. I leave it to experts like Christina here to address policy, although I did a little bit in an earlier incarnation. But I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm interested in everyday meaning and practice. And when Virginie asks us to address what we think is a crucial issue in speaking truth to power, or what science can do, right now for me, power lies in public discourse, in the public sphere. Right now we're at a historical juncture where, like never before, migration is in the air. You can't open a newspaper or turn on the TV without a migration-related topic, and particularly by way of social media, migration and diversity issues are steaming, bubbling all around us. And so what my, as it were, kind of dream or vision of this new initiative that we're trying to craft here is, of course, to deal with the addressing policy and governance and so forth, and issues that we'll hear about from the other speakers here. But my interest is more on what I call the public understanding of migration. Of course, we want to address the purposeful political distortion of migration that's happening out there by politicians, media personalities, social movement leaders, and so forth, address the disinformation and selective omission of facts or outright lies that are in the public sphere. But what I mean by the public understanding of migration is something much more, much deeper, something more like what we'd call an anthropology of knowledge. Not just what the public thinks, or it's not, I don't mean the same as public opinion or public attitudes. I think public opinion is based on certain core understandings of what people think is happening with migration, certain logics that people have. And by those I mean things like zero-sum game. Are people familiar with the idea of a zero-sum game, or the fact that the pie is only so big? And so if you bring in more people, there's less for everyone. And that kind of zero-sum thinking that it underlies people's opinions about migration, that there are only so many public resources that can go around. Jobs, healthcare, places in school, public largesse. This idea that we're dealing with a limited pie and that migrants threaten how much of the pie I can get is a basic logic that underlies a lot of people's thinking. And I think we can address that and try to change it. Or a basic underlying understanding that migrants are really all about their economic worth. How much do they bring to the economy? How many jobs do they add or do they take away? And we see that in so much, especially in a lot of government discussions of migration. Are migrants good for the economy, or are they bad for the economy? And that's a kind of underlying logic or understanding. Or another one that I talk about is the idea of migrants as a kind of incursion to the body, like a bacteria or an invading force, that by someone coming from the outside into an existing body, a nation, a city, that they therefore threaten things like the cultural integrity or the value system or even a healthcare system or a school system. This idea of an incursion from the outside as a threat to the body is one of these underlying logics that I think informs the public understanding of migration. So I think with that kind of perspective, we have to see that the role of academics like ourselves shouldn't just be providing facts to the public sphere, providing our findings, or myth-busting. Myth-busting, of course, is hugely important, but a lot of studies show that myth-busting can actually exacerbate the myth because you've repeated it in order to bust it. Of course, we need to have those sorts of corrective roles in the public sphere, but I think we need to assist policymakers and wider public to think in more complex terms about migration, not just a matter of zero-sum game or economic worth or incursion to the body. That is to help instill what I mean by complex thinking is multi-causality, that migration isn't just about poverty drives migrants, persecution drives refugees. No, it's a lot more complex than that. And a lot of times, our role as academics is reduced to a kind of caricature. I know through experience that journalists and politicians often hate academics because we always say it's complicated. But that's our job, not just to say it's complicated, but to convince through compelling findings wrapped in narratives. And I'll just end by saying that, you know, everyone is capable of complex, multi-causal, multi-factor thinking. Anybody who follows a contemporary miniseries on TV knows about multiple plot lines, multiple characters, and how all of these intersect to produce unpredictable outcomes and so forth. The public knows that. They just don't know that they know how to think in those complex terms. But you turn on Game of Thrones or any miniseries that you want, Nordic detective series or whatever, and multiple plot lines, multiple causalities, and that's how the process works. That's how migration works as well. So that would be my kind of dream for this, this new initiative, this new panel that we're hoping to put together, is yes, to talk to policymakers and to get them to think in more complex terms, but to help change this public understanding of migration, which now, because it's based on simplistic models, is all too easy for people to manipulate. Right.
Thank you very much. I like the idea we already have a TV series. Well, we haven't quite launched the initiative yet, but I think that's a great idea. I would add to this, to you, you know, once I said in an interview, Europe is not a house or a boat, because, you know, the journalists always say, you know, well, the house is, they keep talking about threshold. They say, no, it's not a house, or, and no, the boat is not full. And these are very old metaphors by now. So thank you very much. Christina, Boswell, that's a Boswell.
Okay, thank you very much. So Virginia, I took very seriously your brief of thinking about what when my angry nerd is triggered, and my bugbear is net migration statistics. So I want to talk today a bit about metrics and quantification and what that can do in terms of the way we frame migration issues and the way we devise responses to migration issues. And I have a particular metric in mind. It might not be a surprise to those who have some knowledge of UK immigration politics. It's the net migration target and net migration statistics in general. So in 2010, David Cameron, then Conservative leader, announced that he wanted to adopt a target of restricting or reducing net migration to the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. And this target, but also just the framing of the issue around a net migration statistic, has had a huge and I think very damaging influence on public debate and policy making in the UK. And I'll just perhaps illustrate what I mean by this by drawing on some of the broader sociological literature around what counting and what quantification does to the framing of policy issues. And I'll illustrate that in relation to the net migration target. So the first thing that we do when we count something, and especially when we count people, is that we have to reduce every item to an equivalent unit. So we standardize, we flatten difference, we abstract from diversity, from the nuance, from the context, from the historical or cultural context of a particular phenomenon. We kind of compress difference. And this is very much the case when we talk about numbers of migrants, inflows and outflows and net migration. So what we're doing is we're essentially treating each person as equivalent, and we're aggregating lots of different categories of migrants who have different characteristics, different reasons for migrating, different impacts on receiving societies, and we're saying the more of these we have, the worse it is. We need to reduce this. So it's sort of reducing it to a binary question of more or less and aggregating people who really come from quite diverse different contexts. So that's the first very damaging feature of that type of metric. But the second feature is that type of statistic takes on a particular authority. They have a huge amount of influence, statistics, and that's linked to a long history of statistics and numbers and counting as appearing to convey a kind of objectivity, a precision, a rigour, which looser, more woolly concepts and qualitative data don't appear to be able to achieve. So there's long been a history of privileging the hard sciences and quantitative forms of analysis over softer data. And what happens when we do this, when we ascribe this validity or authority to these numbers, is in effect we're black boxing the various methods and the assumptions and all the things that the decisions that were made in order to derive this data, which often involved quite patchy information sources, sometimes fairly dubious forms of calculation, and so on. But once you have that number, it's amazing to see how, whether in media reporting or whether in political discourse, a number is just plucked out of context and assumed to have this validity, what Latour calls a black boxing of the methods and the steps made in producing this type of number. And we can see that, I mean, I've done quite a bit of research on media and political discourse around the net migration target and other types of metrics. And for the media, there's an enormous appeal in having metrics interlaced in their stories, in their reporting. So media often like to begin with a metric because it has a sort of wow effect, and they like to lace these types of information through their reporting, again, to give this appearance of rigour. Where those kind of metrics are then codified as targets, they become this very strong focus of accountability. So if you set yourself a target as a political actor, you're basically saying, look, I'm going to achieve this quantifiable goal. I'm going to monitor how I achieve it. It will be measured, and you can hold me to account if I don't achieve that. So that's a hugely influential force once you use numbers in that kind of way. And not only is it a strong driver for policy and for politicians, also for their opposition. So, you know, if you look at, for example, the way that the Labour opposition reacted to the net migration target, of course they said this doesn't make sense, we can't put a cap on migration, we're talking about lots of different types of immigrants, but it was irresistible to Labour politicians to hold the government to account for not managing to achieve this target. So time and time again you see in parliamentary debate, you know, but you haven't achieved the net migration target, net migration is rising, and in opposing government on those terms you're actually strengthening and in a sense validating the notion that policy goals should be framed in that way. A third dimension of metrics is that they're portable. They move very easily. They move across cultural contexts. You don't need to translate. They can be taken up in different types of communication. Again, despite their flaws. So they can be easily used. They can be manipulated. They can be added to, subtracted, and so on. Again, black boxing the methods through which they were produced. So just again as an example, the net migration figures are based on a hugely unreliable estimate of migration flows. It's something called the International Passenger Survey. It's a very small sample of what people tell you when they're leaving and entering the UK about why they're coming or leaving. And so on that basis, migration statistics are derived. The net migration numbers are not even endorsed as formally as a national statistic because they're so unreliable, and yet, you know, huge swathes of policy have emanated from the adoption of this target, and public debate has been so hugely influenced by it. And the last point I want to mention in relation to targets is the extent to which they serve by abstracting from nuance, from difference, from characteristics, from features, richer narratives, they do dehumanize the subjects that we're talking about. So again, when we're talking about net migration, migrants as a statistic, of course we're abstracting from people, and charities have long realized that statistics don't elicit pro-social behaviour. They don't elicit empathy. Oxfam doesn't use statistics to try to get people to give money to different causes, what they use is pictures and narrative. And psychology research has borne this out. So when they do studies of people being presented with different information about the plight of different groups, for example, statistics don't have the same kind of impact as narratives and pictures and images and that more qualitative data. So I think the implications for us are, obviously, statistics have a role for researchers. Obviously, many of our disciplines, and in a way it's kind of risky saying this in an audience where there are economists and demographers and so on, but I just think we have to be very careful how we use statistics and also be very aware of the implications of making claims in quantitative ways. So numbers can be a force for good, they can be equalizing, and they can help us hold politicians to account. So I'm not saying that targets and the use of quantitative goals doesn't serve some good, but they can obviously also be profoundly misleading, and I think by abstracting from the specificity and the context of migrants, different types of migrants, in a sense they dehumanize our subject, and I think we have to be very critical and engage very critically with debates that rely too much on metrics.
Thank you very much, Christina. Ferruccio, Pastore, Professor Pastore.
Merci Virginie, et merci à Camille et à Hélène aussi. Good morning, good afternoon. Yes, as Virginie said, I have the dubious privilege of coming from a country which in the last few months has been at the forefront of a slide towards an ever more politicized understanding of migration. A country where the Minister of Interior and also Deputy Prime Minister is in full control of migration and asylum policies, that he is currently shaping and in close coherence with a very explicit stance taken during the campaign last spring, and a country where this minister's party called Lega, the League, which had obtained only slightly over 17% of the voices in last March elections, is now, probably thanks to the policies implemented in these few months, over 30% in the opinion polls. One has to remind that Italy's previous government, which was a center-left government, didn't stand out as a particularly lenient government on migration and asylum issues. It had, for instance, not pushed through a reform of nationality law for second generations, which had been in the pipeline for ages. It had restricted severely appeal rights for asylum seekers. It had made it more difficult for NGOs to operate search and rescue activities, as you certainly have heard. But even against that backdrop, the discontinuity now is extremely evident. And not just in discourses, but also in actual decisions, policy decisions, legislative decisions taken over these few months. And what is interesting is that the action taken over these 5 months has not been prepared through intensive public debates, nor even parliamentary debates. Actually, the bulk of the new measures has been adopted through a governmental urgency decree. So by way of urgency, even if irregular inflows have been decreasing dramatically over the last year, even if crime statistics also show a less worrying situation and are basically decreasing since years. So there is no indicator of an emergency, an actual acute emergency. But still the decisions were taken by urgency with little political debate and even less preparatory research. We are talking today of the role of research. These new measures are not just, so to speak, evidence-free, but even more, they are counter-evidence, meaning that they go directly against, I argue at least, high levels of consensus among scholars and experts. And I will make just 3 examples to let you understand, hopefully, better. But I could bring actually many more, I think. First, virtually all research carried out, particularly since 2015 in Europe, points to the fact that integration support measures for asylum seekers and refugees are all the more effective the sooner they start upon arrival. This is, I think not a single voice that says the opposite among scholars, among researchers and experts. Now, the urgency decree I was mentioning dictates just the opposite, basically by saying that from now on, integration measures, including language courses, will only start upon a positive decision on granting international protection. Second example, remittances are widely considered to be one of the by far most effective poverty reduction tools in poor countries, in sending countries, and by also reducing transfer costs of remittances is widely considered the best way to deter the use of informal channels, which are for several reasons not the ideal ones. Well, against this also rather robust backdrop, the fiscal decree for 2019 introduces a tax, an ad hoc tax of 1.5% on every financial transfer by migrants, which is, as far as I know, one of the very, very few, maybe the only case in receiving countries of migration and sending countries of remittances of an extra taxation, because, of course, the earnings which produce the remittances are already taxed in principle. Final example, in our times of low-cost flights, of powerful transnational networks of different sorts, there is a wide agreement among scholars that structured cooperation with sending and transit countries is essential in order to control migration, to regulate migration somehow. Well, and this probably is particularly true for countries like Italy, which are geographically exposed to unplanned forms of migration, to direct, irregular, mixed, as we say today, mixed flows. In spite of all this, the Italian government is not sitting today in Marrakesh for the signature of a global compact, which is a totally non-binding and toothless international declaration. So here, too, the evidence basis of this decision are mysterious. The political motivations can be obviously intuited. So how to explain this kind of blatantly counter-evidence policy and how to cope with it as researchers? A first quite obvious explanation of this kind of policy is short-termism. Populists, by definition, not only them, of course, but them, by definition, tend to respond to public sentiment, caring only about opinion polls and next elections, not so much about medium and long-term scenarios and prospects and consequences. And this is certainly the case of my country today, but I would argue that there seems to be more than just short-termism. More disturbingly, I would say, and even more cynically, one has the impression that potential unintended effects or perverse effects, some research label them, of such measures are or seem to be, in fact, tailored into the strategy. One has the impression that we are facing self-fulfilling prophecy as a mode of governance. Because then, if things get worse, one can always say, you see, it was even more serious than we expected. We should have been harsher. We should have been stricter. And it's your fault who watered down the measures if it turns out so bad now. But the problem, obviously, with this kind of counter-evidence policy that is, by the way, immersed in a larger sea of what some call post-truth politics, the problem is that it is completely self-referential, or very self-referential, and therefore very hard to debunk. There is very interesting recent research in cognitive science showing that fake news have a capacity to spread quicker and more widely in the public than real news. And they operate a bit like junk food. They're very greasy, very savory, very sugary, and therefore they get immediately into circulation. They give immediate and easy satisfaction, and therefore very difficult to wash out. So to conclude our meeting today and the launch of GIEM is, I think, a bet on the power of knowledge. Of course, if we are here, we still somehow believe in it. But clearly the normal channels for exerting the power of knowledge are or look largely obstructed. And also importantly, there is an issue with the source of knowledge. Experts, professors, intellectuals, people like us basically have, in many countries, I would say, have been effectively bundled into a certain understanding of the elite. And this accusation of elitism nowadays is one of the main, I would say, powerful and effective preventive weapon against the power of knowledge. And the very fact that I say something, even though what I say might be based on years of research, risks to disqualify the argument, even to prove it wrong in some cases. So what to do? Well, one could just retrench in the proverbial ivory tower, provided one has got one available, which are not so many in the field of social sciences in some parts of Europe. But then also disengagement, I think, in such a polarized climate, I think, can turn out to be a form of engagement. So better to engage directly. And here, just I think, just like in the field of climate research, mapping and showing possible futures, likely futures of what we are doing now is possibly the only way or one of the ways to influence the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ferruccio. I think it's nicely complemented. Christina, you talked about this utilitarian vision of using numbers, you know, are migrants worth something? And Ferruccio, you're telling us that, in fact, we're beyond that, right? We're in identitarian politics. You didn't mention Viktor Orban, but I think you thought about him quite or he says, he doesn't care about numbers. There were never supposed to be any migrants in Hungary. That's his take, right? So you can't use even numbers with him, as Christina showed. So, Leo,